we will get started. Welcome everyone to Project Echo Geriatrics. Welcome to all of you, and especially to those of you who are joining us for the first time. I'm Kate Bennett. I'm a geriatrician based in Seattle, although like I mentioned, I'm in Ohio at the moment with my parents. And I'm glad that you all joined us. We're going to run the session like we usually do. We're going to start off with a brief didactic, and we have an amazing talk from Dr. Labardi on depression in late life. And then after that, we're going to talk about a complex case and talk about that with an interprofessional group of panelists and all of you. This is an all teach, all learn situation where I appreciate everyone's contributions and we all learn from each other. So thank you for joining. I'm going to start off by introducing our speaker here. So Dr. Beth Labardi, for those of you who have been joining ECHO for a while or have been on an ECHO session before, she will look familiar to you because she is the geriatric psychiatrist who has been on our ECHO panel since ECHO started back in 2016. And she is a really fantastic geriatric psychiatrist based over at the Seattle VA and has a lot to teach us about many things. And today, what she's going to teach us about is depression in late life. So thank you so much, Dr. Labardi.
Thank you for that introduction, and happy to be here as I am every month. So yeah, I'm talking about depression in late life today. Here's a little outline of what I'm hoping to cover. It's a short time together, so we'll talk a bit about prevalence and then medical morbidity and comorbidity in this population, and a bit about differences in presentation in depression across the lifespan. We'll talk about simple steps with a diagnostic workup, and then our treatment options for late life depression. So just briefly with prevalence of depression, this is old data, but what we always refer to, Dan Blazer's study back in the 80s, and this data actually is surprisingly not terribly shifted to present day, that the rates of major depressive disorder in older adults are actually lower than in the general adult population. You can see that 0.8% is less than the approximately 3% that we think of meeting criteria for this in a general adult population. However, older adults are far more likely to report subsyndromal depressive symptoms that just aren't meeting criteria for major depression. So it's worth noting there are more symptoms than folks actually meeting criteria for that in this population. And there's some differences across whatever setting you're looking at or working in. In a primary care setting, the rates are actually higher. The prevalence is higher, closer to 8% meeting criteria for major depressive disorder. In the hospital, even higher, and in nursing homes, the highest. And this really speaks to, I think, some of the medical comorbidity that can exist with depression and might reflect some of those differences in medical settings as opposed to just a general community population. And did need to talk because of that about medical comorbidity and depression. They are frequently comorbid, having depression and medical problems. And there's a lot of interesting bidirectional pathways between depression and a number of medical conditions, including cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and even things you wouldn't expect like osteoporosis and hip fracture, that these conditions increase the risk of depression, and depression increases the risk of these conditions. It's also just notable that older patients with depression have more medical illnesses than older patients who are not depressed. In a study of over 15,000 primary care patients, this difference was 7.9 average medical diagnoses in those with depression compared to 3 in those without. So again, notable that if you're working in the medical field, you're probably seeing more older adults with depression. And it's really important that we focus in on the depression bit, despite all the medical comorbidity and complexity that you see in a geriatric population, because Depression really does impair social and physical functioning, and it leads to an increased perception of poor health, which increases a number of things that can cause other morbidity, not just doctor's appointments, but medication use, emergency department visits, hospitalizations. There's even an increased odds of death in those diagnosed with depression. So despite all the things that you're having to manage in a primary care setting, don't neglect the depression bit. In order to do that, though, you've got to detect it. And we know the symptoms of depression. They apply to older adults as well. But there are some generalized differences across the lifespan that are worth noting. Older adults are more likely to have more distinct psychomotor features, so motor retardation or agitation. They're more likely to have a greater somatic focus, so focusing less on a depressed mood and more on physical complaints as a manifestation of that, especially pain or gastrointestinal complaints, and cognitive complaints as well. And we know that cognitive impairment is more common in those with depression as well, or cognitive complaints. And depression, of course, isn't good for cognition either, another bidirectional relationship. Psychotic features are also more common in late life. And delusions are actually more common than hallucinations in this population, particularly things like delusions of guilt. So some long ago forgiven minor incident is now some huge problem that someone is going to be punished for, or deserves punishment for, or is causing some other big problem in their life or the world. And we hear a lot about risk of suicide in older adults, but it is worth noting that this is particular to some demographic populations of older patients, not all, but still very worth knowing those populations that are at particularly high risk of suicide. And given time constraints, I'm not going to go over the last 20 years of CDC data that break it down really nicely by race, sex, and age. This is a nugget that just applies and says the most important bit I wanted to convey. The population that drives really high risk of suicide in later life really is white males. That's not the case with other demographics that are aging. It really is this particular subpopulation. And you can see here even there's even differences between younger old age and older old age, with just an increasing risk in this population in particular. And this study is notable because they happen to note that 39% of these individuals who died by suicide had seen a primary care doctor in the last week, showing that there's some place for intervention and screening here that could save lives. So how do we screen? Fortunately, screening is recommended for all adults by the US Preventative Services Task Force. In older individuals, you have a few options that are validated. My preferred go-to is the Geriatric Depression Scale, which is the best validated, but just as a note, don't use it in moderate to severe dementia. So this is for folks with milder cognitive impairment or who are cognitively intact. This is the short form of the Geriatric Depression Scale. It's 15 yes or no questions, asking someone to reflect on how they've been feeling in the past week. This is an easier task cognitively, to reflect over a shorter period of time that they're remembering more clearly, and to give a yes or no answer, as opposed to ranking their answer somewhere on a scale. So I like it for that reason. And I like that it has less focus on neurovegetative symptoms that could be impacted simply by physical changes someone's experiencing with aging. The PHQ-9 has more of those questions, but the PHQ-9 is also validated in late life. So if you're comfortable with that, that's a fair option too. And if you are looking at potential depression in someone with dementia, the Cornell scale for depression and dementia is the best validated in that population and is administered to a caregiver. Then the basic stuff, make sure there's been a recent physical exam and basic labs, make sure we're not missing any sort of depression mimics that can occur medically. Especially, this is important if medications are being considered. And then other basic stuff, make sure you know the past psychiatric history and family history. That can be helpful in forming a diagnosis more clearly, and it can be helpful in guiding treatment options. So treatment, I wanted to start with psychotherapy because in a study done at Columbia years ago, it was just looking at a general population poll, it was actually found that psychotherapy is preferred on average by older adults over medication. And I think there can be a lot of assumptions to the opposite. So it is worth offering this as a treatment option for those for whom it's appropriate. There are a few different evidence-based forms of psychotherapy for late life depression. And psychotherapy can not only be a treatment in and of itself for depression, but it can help more successfully navigate through life crises, which can increase depressive symptoms. It improves the development of coping skills going forward in sort of a preventative sense for future episodes of depression. And it can aid in the compliance with biological treatment options. So it doesn't have to be one or the other. If a biological treatment option is warranted, psychotherapy can be a good adjunct for that as well, if it's available for that patient and if they would like to engage in that. Pharmacological treatment options, we all know this, but I have to say it, older adults are more sensitive to medication side effects in general, right? There are changes to metabolism that can increase the risk of accumulation and toxicity. And there are so many side effects that could really impact functioning and quality of life. And psychotropics are among the most common medications associated with preventable adverse drug events in older patients. So really take this role seriously. You all know that you start with lower doses, you escalate doses more slowly. As a general guide with antidepressants, on average, we would say start with half of the lowest therapeutic dose for an adult, and then increase to the lowest potential therapeutic dose after a week or two. In someone who's very frail, you could even go slower than that, lower than that, but that's a general guide. You do have to use an adequate dose for an adequate duration, though. So you do have to get to at least that lowest therapeutic dose of an antidepressant. And there's some evidence that late life depression responds more slowly. So up to 8 to 12 weeks may be a more reasonable expectation than the 6 we often think of. These are our antidepressant options that have all shown some benefit in late life. Of note, I'm not going to talk about TCAs, even though there is evidence that they're helpful, just because they're third line due to the significant adverse effects and risks in this population. So SSRIs are first line because they're effective, relatively easy to use, and have relatively good tolerability and safety. Here are the examples of them. They have evidence for treatment of depression and anxiety disorders in older adults, but this is true of all the antidepressants we're going to talk about. There is no convincing evidence for efficacy in depression in the setting of dementia. So it's just worth noting we're talking about individuals without a dementia diagnosis. The side effects that we commonly educate all our adults on still apply. And there are a few that are much less common in a younger population, but are risks that we should be educating our older patients on if we're using these medications. One is increased bleeding risk, particularly the risk of cerebral, gastrointestinal, or post-surgical bleeding, especially in those who already have a high bleeding risk or are on blood thinners. Hyponatremia due to SIADH is much more common in older individuals taking these than younger. And it typically occurs within the first few weeks of treatment. So it's not a bad idea to plan on checking a sodium about a month after starting one of these medications. And then falls and fractures. Almost all antidepressants increase the risk of falls, unfortunately. And serotonergic drugs do seem to have some independent risk of fracture as well when given chronically. So like so many medications, that's a risk to weigh with these as well. Now, SNRIs would be the preferred alternative or second line. They have benefit in late life, not only in depression and anxiety disorders, but also neuropathic pain, fibromyalgia. And they share a lot of the same side effects as SSRIs, including risk of falls and fractures, SIADH, and increased risk of bleeding, though that may be slightly less than SSRIs. Then these are some of the second generation antidepressants, which do have some evidence for use in late life depression as well. They all have at least some studies looking at that use. Bupropion or Wellbutrin is a real activating antidepressant, which can be used alone. It's also has some evidence for use as an augmentation strategy or to alleviate sexual side effects from other antidepressants. And it also has an FDA approval for smoking cessation. Mirtazapine is we commonly think of that as being used in patients that have insomnia and poor appetite, where we're kind of exploiting the side effects of this type of medication. Or it can be used for those that don't tolerate the gastrointestinal or sexual side effects of many other antidepressants, since it lacks those. Some newer agents that are just worth noting because they went out of their way to show that they work in older patients. Vilazodone, does seem to be effectiveness in an older depressed population. I think everyone would like to see more data supporting that it's a fair choice. And 40-oxetine, even to just get FDA approval, went out of their way to make sure that they included a good amount of older individuals in their studies, their open label studies, and looked at cognitive performance. And shockingly, it works. It improves mood, and cognitive performance improves as well, which is what we would expect of folks that have improved depression. So those are other options that could be considered second line. Now, I wanted to note that antipsychotics are sometimes used for depression with psychotic features or as an antidepressant augmentation. Aripiprazole or Abilify in particular has efficacy for this role in older populations, even with studies from just last year. However, weigh this step really cautiously because these medications are rife with motor, metabolic, and vascular risk in older persons. And ECT is generally safer and more effective for people needing that level of treatment. But it can be hard to access and there's stigma. So I appreciate that. And with that being said, I can't have a talk on late life depression without mentioning ECT because it is such an effective treatment, particularly with older patients. You're probably not going to be the people ordering it, but I want you to be aware it is a safe, effective, and rapid treatment for late life depression. And it's especially helpful in depression with psychosis, those with suicidal ideation, and those with really big functional impact from their depression, where it might be leading to weight loss, dehydration, deconditioning, basically the people we want to get better quickly because there's a big cost to that depression. This is a very effective treatment to consider. And there are modifications that can be done to the treatment to minimize the risk of cognitive side effects from ECT. And that's all I've got. So I'm happy to take questions.